Excellent. So welcome everybody from wherever in the world you're joining us from. My name is Alex. I'm going to be your host and tour guide for today's session. Many of you know me already. I'm the VP of the Green Olive Collective, originally born and raised in New Zealand, but spent nearly a decade touring, leading trips in France, Spain, New Zealand, and now of course Israel, Palestine with Green Olive. There's a lot of great Green Olive supporters on today's call, so welcome to you all. If you're new to Green Olive, we are an Israeli-Palestinian social cooperative. We've been giving political, educative, and cultural tours of this land for nearly 14 years now. We show people the main sites, the famous stuff that people want to see. But we also try and give a level of political analysis that many tour companies aren't able to provide. All of our work is done through the lens of trying to promote democratic values and human rights. We believe the occupation should end as soon as possible and a just solution be found. And in the course of the last, nearly 2 years, as we've come to live with COVID, we've tried to do a lot of different online events, partnering up with many different like-minded organizations to illustrate their work and show people who are maybe stuck in quarantine and unable to visit Israel what's going on in this interesting and beautiful country. If you haven't joined all of our events, we have many available to watch on our YouTube channel. If you're watching this on our YouTube channel, welcome to you. And today's session is going to focus on a specific part of our land. We figured that to celebrate the recent reopening of Israel's borders, we would kind of explore two of the more interesting borders. Those are the northern borders, which Israel shares between itself and Syria and Lebanon. Very, very interesting corner of the country. We're going to be able to jump back and forwards across the borders, which are usually impossible to cross. The tour today should take us hopefully about 45 minutes. We'll see how long it takes us, in fact. And then we have 45 minutes if anybody has questions or comments I want to make afterwards. We have time for that as well. But we shouldn't be more than an hour and a half together today. Like all of our online events, registration is free. We encourage people to share this with people around the world. You're all welcome to join us. But of course, these kind of events do cost money to put on. And a lot of our staff have been badly affected by the impact of COVID. So what we do is we encourage you at the end of the presentation and the tour today to leave a contribution, whatever you felt it was worth. We thank you very much for that. I'll paste a link in the chat just here so everyone can see. If you need the links like said to you, you can find it at contribute.greenolivetours.com. There's a fast link for anybody who wants to leave something at the end. And as well as supporting the work of our collective, we also donate 10% of all proceeds to an amazing charity, the PCRF. We did an online event with them if you'd like to learn more about their work. They provide healthcare to kids in many places where they just can't get it, specifically Palestinian refugees. So many of them who are stuck in refugee camps in places like Syria and Lebanon can be supported by your generous contributions. So my friends, I think that's pretty much it by way of introduction. And I'm going to jump right in and start sharing my screen, unless anybody has any questions before we begin. All right, excellent. So, as we often tend to do with these tours, we start with a little bit of history, very, very quickly. And I'm going to start up here with a map from the Ottoman times. The Ottomans ruled this land for 400 years. The area we're focusing on today is up here. This is today the kind of tri-border area. And you can see, obviously, that in the Ottoman times, this was all part of their great empire and there was no restrictions. People could move pretty freely between the different administrative districts, which are marked here in different colors. But that all came to an end really in the First World War. There was a famous document which was signed between a British and French diplomat known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And this is the kind of cause of many of today's problems, you could say. It's obviously more complicated than that. But you can see some of today's modern international borders already drawn on this map. This line running through the middle of zones A and B is mostly the border today between Syria and Iraq. Part of it is between Syria and Jordan. The British and French diplomats were drawing lines on a map pretty much at with no regard for the indigenous peoples. And they were trying to basically divide the Middle East up into two different zones of influence. So the pink influence and letter B was for the British, and the blue and the letter A was for the French. The area on the left-hand side here along the coast roughly corresponds with today's Lebanon. Area A, today's Syria. Not exactly, there were some changes, but more or less. Both of these areas came under French protection. Of course, it's a bit of a euphemism. Control maybe is a better word. B is mostly today's Iraq and Jordan. And then over here in yellow was supposed to be an international zone. That's today's Israel-Palestine. And another thing which is pretty well known about the Sykes-Picot Agreement is that it kind of split the territory of some important ethnic minorities. So for example, the Kurds are a famous group who are now spread between Turkey, Syria, Iraq. And the same thing is true down here in our little corner in the yellow, where the Sykes-Picot Agreement was in many ways designed to split up the territory of the Druze. The Druze are another ethnic group who we'll talk a bit about today. This is a kind of more zoomed in map which shows where the Druze mostly live today. And you can see that they're spread between Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. One of the many goals of the Sykes-Picot Agreement was to make sure that the Druze were split into different countries to dilute their power. This was a classic move by colonialists to try and divide and conquer. The Druze are a super interesting group. If there is demand, we might well be able to invite on a Druze speaker and host a second event specifically on the Druze. But just to kind of give you a very brief introduction to who the Druze are. By the way, I'm saying Druze with a D and an R, not with a J. It's not the Jews. The Druze are a kind of ethno-religious group who are in many ways kind of shrouded in mystery because a lot of their religion remains secret. It's impossible to marry into the Druze ethno-religion. You are born into it, and only the kind of initiated elders are fully aware of the full tenets of the religion. The Druze faith begins as an offshoot from Islam in Egypt, in Fatimid Egypt in the 10th century, where they were persecuted as heretics and they are forced to flee. And they end up mostly in this part of the world, spread mostly on kind of high mountain peaks, where they develop a couple of very interesting kind of cultural adaptations. One of them is that they become warriors. The Druze are very known as being fearsome, brave warriors. And they also develop an interesting kind of strategy for living under different empires and living as a minority. And that is basically to be loyal to whichever power is in charge. So today, this ends up with some interesting kind of contradictions, perhaps, where you have Druze, for example, in the Galilee here, or the Carmel in Israel, who serve in the Israeli army and have done for many, many years. And other Druze living, say, in Mount Lebanon, serving in the Lebanese army, same in Syria. And there are many, famous stories of loyal Druze warriors serving in each one of these armies. So our next stop is here in Nabi Shuaib, which is a Druze holy site. This is actually the most important Druze holy site in the world. The Druze religion, although it comes from Islam, sort of borrows and adapts and changes, including many other different types of religion. It actually borrows from Greek, kind of pagan religion. There's elements of Christianity and Judaism, even more for Eastern religions like Hinduism, for example. Druze, confusing myself now, Druze believe in reincarnation. So this shrine here is built around a tomb, which belongs to, depending on which language you use, Nabi Shuaib, the prophet Shuaib, who is believed by the Druze to be a reincarnation of Jethro, who was the uncle of Moses. They believe that Moses, Jesus, Adam, Noah, Muhammad are all important prophets, many of whom have been reincarnated at various points. This is a beautiful shrine sitting on the banks of the Sea of Galilee. Looking down here, you can see the sea in the distance. This is the Arbel Cliff. It's the most important Druze pilgrimage site, but of course most Druze, especially those living in Syria and Lebanon, are unable to visit because they are unable to enter into Israel. Rachel in the chat has just given me an important correction. I don't know what I said, but Jethro was the father-in-law of Moses. I may have misspoken. So thank you, Rachel, for keeping me honest. Definitely Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses. Okay, so we're going to move from the shore of the Galilee back into our main region, today's tour. And we're going to talk a bit more about the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights are a very strategically important part of the country. This is the view of the Golan Heights looking kind of south and west, so from Syria looking down towards Israel. And I chose this view because it really illustrates very nicely how dominant the Golan Heights are, looking over the Sea of Galilee and looking over the rest of the country of Israel. They're a volcanic plateau, depending on where you go, anywhere from about 300 meters above sea level, all the way up to Mount Hermon up here, which is nearly 3,000 meters above sea level. And of course, the Jordan River, which flows down from the slopes of Mount Hermon, enters eventually the Sea of Galilee, which is 200 meters below sea level. So when you combine the fact that the Sea of Galilee is below and the Golan Heights is above, you end up with about a 1,000 meter plateau. It's a volcanic plateau. Even in this map, you can see a few little extinct volcanoes dotted around, long extinct, but it does mean that the soil here is quite fertile. And because it's a bit higher, further north, it's one of the only parts of Israel which receives a lot of regular water. So it has this kind of dual function of being a very important, like strategic, militarily speaking, plateau looking over the country, and also the source of much fertile agriculture and water. For most of history, this area has been one area controlled by whichever power is ruling the Middle East at the time. That's certainly how it was under the Ottomans. And it's really only divided when Sykes-Picot is signed. And this becomes the border, this green line here, more or less became the border between British and French-controlled Middle Eastern territory. In the 1948 war, which sees Israel become an independent country, that becomes the border between Israel and Syria, this green line running along here. So from 1948 until 1967, Israeli settlements in the Hula Valley down here and people living along the banks of the Sea of Galilee had Syrian soldiers perched up here on the Golan Heights, fairly frequently shooting at them. You know, Israel and Syria never had a peace treaty. They only had an armistice, meaning this was not a recognized border. It was merely a ceasefire line, and there were skirmishes along it pretty frequently. Those skirmishes turned into a full-on war for the first time in 1967, which is, of course, the Six-Day War. So in the Six-Day War, this is a map which often Israelis will show you, showing the small Israel completely surrounded and attacked on all sides by these three huge Arab powers. But actually the war was a massive military success for Israel. And they end up conquering huge amounts of territory in just 6 days. The Sinai Desert from Egypt down here, which was eventually traded back to Egypt in exchange for the peace treaty in 1979. The Gaza Strip here and the West Bank were conquered from Jordan. They're still occupied to this day. And the third area, the one we're focusing on today, is a little corner up here of Syria, the Golan Heights. Unlike those territories which were put under military occupation kind of indefinitely, the Golan Heights was eventually in 1981 officially annexed by Israel. Now that annexation was not recognized at the time by any other country, but Israel at least considers this to be officially Israeli territory. And I think it's fair to say that most Israelis, whether they're left wing, right wing, whatever, the Golan Heights is very much in the kind of psyche of most Israelis today, considered an integral part of the country in a way that the West Bank and Gaza never were. I think that it's very difficult for an Israeli to imagine ever, for example, giving up control over the Golan Heights. That's a really important step to understand. During the course of the war, a huge number of people flee the fighting or are forced from their home. This map, it's in Arabic, but you see the Sea of Galilee down here, and this is the Golan Heights. Every one of these dots is a former Syrian city or town, usually, that was depopulated in the war. So as you can see down below, 131,000 of the 137,000 people of the Golan are depopulated. This area was very effectively ethnically cleansed, and almost exclusively they flee deeper into Syria. So what about those 6,000 people who remain? So the 6,000 who remained were almost exclusively Druze, and they remained in 5 towns which were not depopulated. One of them was eventually demolished in the 70s, leaving us, by the Israeli government, I should say, and the people forced to one of the other 4 towns, leaving us with 4 Druze towns today in the occupied Golan. Before the war, the Druze were a minority in the Golan, only about 6% of the total, but they become instantly a massive majority, almost 99% of the total who stay there. But of course, the Israelis also started to settle people in the Golan as well. And today, the population of the Golan is more or less split 50-50 between Druze and Israeli Jewish settlers, who again, to be clear, definitely don't, in the vast majority of cases, consider themselves to be settlers. They're not settling like they are in the West Bank for ideological or religious reasons usually. So there's quite a different kind of motivation for most people who are living in the Golan. The 4 towns you can see on this map, these 4 red dots, the biggest one is the city of Majd al-Shams. And what is Majd al-Shams like? Well, you can see a pretty nice house here. This is fairly typical of Majd al-Shams. It's not a super rich place, but it's fairly well developed. It is kind of on the periphery, so they do struggle to get the same resources that many parts of the center of Israel get. But you can see people are not living in abject poverty here. The Druze people live like any other religion, with more or less tradition. This is a cool photo showing a mother and daughter. The mother wearing much more traditional clothing and the daughter much less, obviously. Druze are very well educated, statistically speaking. A huge number are attending universities and getting qualifications as doctors and lawyers. The religious Druze will only become fully initiated into the religion at age 40. So you don't usually see people dressing kind of traditionally or in more religious ways until they're a little bit older. Druze men wear this very typical and distinctive white cap and have these incredible moustaches. So they make for a very kind of distinctive look if you're ever visiting the Golan Heights. But life is not all roses and rainbows in the Golan. This is the town of Majd al-Shams, as we said, nice houses. But if you turn around here, you can see how close they live to the Syrian border. This is the Syrian border right here. This house is only a couple of meters away from the border. And all of these people have family on both sides. They're completely cut off from their relatives in Syria. And only in very, very rare occasions have people ever been able to cross the border. Today, things are much easier. Obviously, you can communicate with cell phones, internet and stuff. But previously, the only way people could communicate is by shouting. And there's a hill just on the other side of the border, which got the nickname the Shouting Hill. where people would come to the little raised piece of land here and yell news across. So-and-so's got married, or someone's just had a baby, so that their neighbors and friends and relatives over on the other side of the border could hear them. The only people who were able to cross were brides. Because the Druze don't marry outside their religion, they have to marry other Druze. And there have been several occasions where Israeli Druze women were allowed to cross the border, entering into Syria, on the condition that they never return. This is a one-way crossing. So they must leave their Israeli Druze family behind, moving over to the Syrian side. And if anyone's actually interested in this topic specifically, there's a really good movie called The Syrian Bride, which deals specifically with this topic. And if you like, at the end of the tour, I can paste a link in the chat. We actually have a copy of that movie on our blog, so you can watch it if you're interested. The other thing which the Druze on the Israeli side have to contend with is living under military occupation. Right? It's not over. So just here on the other side of the border, you can see another street in Majd al-Shams. By the way, this is the Druze flag, which you see flying in many of these towns, the different colors. You can see it more clearly here. Many Druze in Israel proper will show their allegiance to the state of Israel by adding the Star of David there. In the Golan Heights, that's very unusual. You usually just see the plain Druze flag. Oops, that's not right. This is what I wanted to show you, the plain Druze flag. And you'll also see this image in some places in Majd al-Shams. This is the international symbol for a minefield. And just go back to the presentation. Sorry. We're zooming back into Majd al-Shams. Apologies for closing that. It's a mistake. On one side of the street, you can see the Druze flag. On the other side of the street, houses under construction. And in the background, I don't know if you can make out that same minefield symbol we just saw before, the international red triangle on the yellow base. There's an active minefield here, and many places throughout the Golan are still actively mined. So the children living in these homes have mines in their backyard. It's a really terrible situation. There have been 66 occasions in the past, or since 1967, since the occupation begins, where mines have exploded, injuring and in many cases killing people. And just above that, you can see a military base. So imagine living here, you are quite literally underneath the occupation. The Israeli soldiers are there sitting above you all the time. An interesting chat question popped up asking what language the Druze speak. So the Druze speak Arabic and mostly identify as Arabs. Some do not. Some say that the Druze are a separate, separate ethnicity, but mostly they are speaking Arabic, which is indistinguishable from other Arabs in the region, and consider themselves to be as Arab as an Arab Muslim. The one place where that changes slightly is in the ethnicity. So this is a Israeli ID card. And in the Golan Heights, those 4 Druze towns, about 25,000 people, only 20% of those people are actually citizens of Israel. Most of them do not accept the Israeli occupation, and most of them have an undefined nationality. They're given travel documents, they're often given ID numbers, so they are eligible for things like social security in many cases. It's a pretty similar situation actually to what happens in East Jerusalem, where Israel considers the territory to be Israeli. It's under Israeli control and administration fully, not under army administration, but civilian administration. But the people there, by and large, refuse to accept that occupation, and they refuse to take citizenship. Now that is changing slightly over time, There are more now who have accepted Israeli citizenship than previously. But the majority of the Druze in the Golan are still loyal to the government of Syria. Now that means Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian dictator. Now this has obviously become a pretty hot topic since the Syrian civil war begins. There have been, open demonstrations in Israeli-controlled Druze towns like Masjid al-Shams in support of Bashar al-Assad. Now you might think, but surely the Druze, by their own kind of philosophy, should be loyal to the place that rules them. Well, this is, of course, always a big debate when the rule changes. At what point do you become loyal to the new ruler? And for many years, it was kind of expected that the Golan Heights would be traded back to Syria and they would become Syrians again. This is certainly what the majority of the Druze in the Golan Heights would like. But since the death of the elder al-Assad in 1995, it seems like this chance of a peace deal is less likely. Of course, in the 90s, it seemed very much the fashionable thing to do. Israel had just signed peace treaties with Jordan, the Palestinian Authority was created, signed peace treaties with Egypt where they exchanged territory in exchange for peace. So it seemed like it could be possible, but that's no longer really on the table. And certainly with the Syrian civil war happening, any chance of a peace treaty is almost impossible. And the government of Benjamin Netanyahu pretty much ruled this out as well. Someone in the chat just asked me how they travel, which is an interesting question. Usually they're able to receive travel documents from the state of Israel. So it's like a laissez-passer. So it's not exactly a passport. It's usually valid only for sort of one trip. They are able to travel on this kind of temporary Israeli travel document. So a super complicated and interesting situation. And I think it kind of shows that this occupation really is not accepted, neither by the people living here nor the international community, in a way which the Druze of 1948, the Druze living in Israel, did accept this. They realized that they were going to be living under the state of Israel. So Druze living in places like the Galilee or the Carmel Mountains near Haifa, they do accept Israeli rule. They are citizens and have been since 1948. They've served in the army for all those years as well. They have Israeli passports, and maybe they are victims of discrimination, but they are citizens on paper at least, just like any Jewish Israeli. So quite different between the Druze of the two areas. One thing you do see sometimes in Majd al-Shams are UN vehicles, because it's the nearest big town to a big UN base, which since 1974 has tried to keep the peace between Israel and Syria. And to be fair, they've done a very good job. It's called UNDOF. And this is their main base, just south of Majd al-Shams, which is this red pin up above. The 4 red pins, by the way, are the 4 Druze towns. The one in the middle there, which is lighter, is the one which was demolished and depopulated in the 1970s. So the UN have the job of keeping the peace between Israel and Syria, and they do so by maintaining a buffer zone. These 2 purple lines are called, guess what, the purple line. They were drawn on the map first with a purple pen and the name stuck. This is UNDOF line Alpha on the west side, UNDOF line Bravo on the east side. This is a demilitarized zone with a UN patrol. It's under Syrian civilian administration, so you can enter from the Syrian side, you cannot enter from the Israeli side. And there's really been almost no violent incidents, very, very few, between Israel and Syria since 1974. The big war that did follow the 1967 Six-Day War was in 1973. This was the Yom Kippur War, where Arab countries, Syria and Egypt, namely, although they managed to regain a lot of prestige from this war, they kind of had a political victory in the 1973 war. Territory didn't really change hands that much. The one exception to that rule would be the town of Quneitra, right on the border here. So Quneitra was controlled by Israel in 1967, became part of Israeli-occupied Golan, but was recaptured by the Syrians in 1973 in the Yom Kippur War. And it's today in this kind of UN buffer zone. The town today is completely abandoned and it is completely empty. And that is because before the Israelis pulled out in 1973, they basically left a scorched earth policy behind and they destroyed the town of Quneitra. There are ways to visit it if you are connected with the UN or the Syrian government and you enter from the Syrian side. Now that's not easy to do, but I have managed to find a video of someone who managed to do that exact thing, which I can play you some of now, just to give you an idea of how Quneitra looks and how it was left behind by the Israelis. This was the biggest town in the Syrian Congo. Nearly 40,000. See, just pummeled with bullet holes. There's a firing zone, as a practice area. And they're just completely gutted off layout. You can actually see it quite clearly from the Israeli side. Video there, I think, and show you just one or two more quick things which found there end up being on the other side of this UN line. So the most impressive building which remained on the Israeli side of the line is this one. And this is the Syrian military headquarters of the Golan Heights. Pretty impressive building. It was actually built by the Soviets in 1952. The Soviets were close allies with Syria and most of the Arab countries throughout the Cold War. And this was a kind of Soviet-built Syrian military building, which ends up being on the Israeli side. And you can enter and kind of wander around this very eerie building, which is now covered in graffiti. And we can do that too. We can go inside now. We can climb the staircase and end up on the roof, where you do have incredible views looking back at the Israeli side, where you can see these extinct volcanic cones. You can see all the graffiti that people have done here. A few more volcanic cones in the distance. And then looking out this way towards Syria itself. A pretty incredible building. Quneitra, by the way, can you see the buildings of Quneitra just in the distance there? Just over there. Someone asked in the chat why the Syrians haven't rebuilt Quneitra, which is a great question. The main reason is to leave it as kind of proof of the Israeli barbarism. You know, they want to show how awful the Israelis were. Look at the terrible things they did to our people and to our towns. But also because it's inside the buffer zone and so close to the Israeli border, that's pretty difficult to imagine they'd ever be able to rebuild it. You know? I did want to point out one interesting exception to the rule. I said there haven't really been any violent incidents since 1974. And well, that's mostly true. There have been a couple of exceptions. And one of them was actually just a few months ago. In October 2021, a Druze man named Midat Saleh was actually assassinated by the Israelis in this town here, Ain el-Tina, which is only a few hundred meters from the Israeli border. And the story is, it's all classified, so we don't know the official kind of army version of the story, but most journalists tend to agree that what happened was an Israeli sniper actually shot and killed this man from the Israeli side of the border without crossing over. This is the generally accepted story. Why would they try and assassinate this man? Well, he was actually born in Majd al-Shams, lived under Israeli rule for many years, was actually arrested for terrorist activities, spent 20 years nearly in Israeli jails before eventually being released in the late 1990s. And he was one of the few who were able to cross the border into Syria, like those famous Syrian brides, again, on the condition he never returned. The Israelis say that he was engaging in activities trying to link the Syrian government to Iran, planning to attack Israel from the Golan Heights. And just a few months ago, he was assassinated across the border. An incredible story which didn't get anywhere near the media attention I kind of expected it to, and maybe felt it should have, just here, less than a kilometer away from the border. I thought we'd also just take a quick look inside one of these towns on the Syrian side, just to give you an idea, because this is something which you cannot do if you come to visit the Golan Heights from the Israeli side in person. But today we're able to go and visit the Syrian Golan. You can see it's pretty green up here, but of course devastated as well by the Syrian civil war. I mean, there was fighting mostly in the middle stages of the war, right up to the border. Rebels did actually take control of the border crossings into Jordan at some points. The UN were very concerned about the fighting getting closer. There were days you could see and hear fighting from the Israeli side, but now all of this territory is back under the control of Bashar al-Assad and the government forces. But this is how things look on the Syrian side. What about other groups who were forced to flee? So we talked about the Druze. This is a formerly Syrian town, again, on the Israeli side. This is the town of Al-Kushniya, which was actually a Cherkessian town. Now, the Cherkessians are a very interesting group on their own, another group we could have another whole online event about. To give you the kind of two-sentence summary of the Cherkessians, in the middle of the 1800s, when the Russian Empire conquered what's now the north of the Black Sea, the area around Sochi in Russia and Georgia, they encountered a Muslim ethnic group called the Cherkessians. And as they Christianized the mountainous regions of the Caucasus, they forced this group into exile. And the Ottoman Empire took them in, and they settled throughout the Ottoman Empire. There's 2 Cherkessian towns in Israel today. The people living there are now Israeli citizens. They are Muslim, but they are not Arab. And there were some Cherkessians living in this town here, Al-Kushniya. They fled the fighting. This was their town mosque. So today this is in the Israeli-controlled Golan, sitting on the side of one of the main roads running through the middle of the Golan. If you pull over, as this reno is done, you can wander around this mosque again. You can see it's covered in bullet holes, and you can even go up to the top of the minaret tower. And I'd love to take you up to the top of the minaret tower ourselves. This is the view you get of the green Golan. We're looking towards Syria. Again, you can see some of the old volcanic cones over here. You can also see, pretty tragically, in the kind of waves of the grass itself where buildings used to be, you can see the stones here of homes probably. This is all the remains of the village. All that was left was a couple of sheds and the mosque itself. Here's the road, and there's the minaret close up. A couple of tourists taking a photo who got distorted by the 360-degree camera. Okay, so from here I want to move just slightly further north to a fascinating corner of the Golan, a small Israeli farm where 2 years ago, the American ambassador to Israel came to pay a visit alongside the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And incredibly, they inaugurated a new Jewish settlement in the Golan Heights, which they called Ramat Trump Heights, named after, of course, the dear leader who had just recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. The only country in the world, other than Israel, to recognize Israeli sovereignty over the Golan is the United States, and that was done during Trump's reign. to celebrate this, they inaugurated this new settlement. All they actually built, however, was this fancy sign. They brought lots of journalists up there, and I can inform you that since then, absolutely nothing has been done. The current sign looks like this. It's a pretty embarrassing sight for people like Friedman, the ambassador, and Trump. There is nothing built whatsoever, but in theory, this could become a new town with Israeli Jewish settlers living in Trump Heights, which would be quite a sight to see. We're going to now go up to the top of the hill. The highest point in Israeli-controlled territory is right here, 2,222 meters above sea level. This is Mount Hermon, where there is an Israeli ski slope, a couple of different ski runs, which might surprise a lot of people who think that Israel is just desert. But this is a ski resort right up on the top of the hill, very, very close to the tri-border point between Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. It's actually snowed quite heavily there just this last week. So there'll be a lot more snow than there is in this picture up there today. And there are plenty of people skiing up there, probably this weekend as well. And all that snow melts, goes underground, some of it through the rock, others run down the hill, and makes for a lot of streams and springs. So from here, I want to take you to see one of the most important springs just at the foothills of Mount Hermon, and that is Banyas. So welcome to Banyas. They think the name Banyas comes from the Greek god Pan, who was worshipped here. There was an important ancient civilization, both Greek and later Romans lived here, and you can still see into the rocks carved these niches where they think Roman idols were worshipped. But this is also an important Christian site. In the Byzantine times, this becomes an important Christian site, built around the place where Peter, Saint Peter, and Jesus met. This is where Jesus told Peter he would be the rock on which his church was built. So it's an important Christian pilgrimage site. If you look over here to the left, you can also see a Druze shrine up in the hills. So you can see it's a very important place of worship, and that's because of the water which flows from this cave. Har Hermon is just up above, out of sight, and it flows from the spring down to these pools, and then becomes two or three great rivers. One of them is the Jordan River, probably the most famous river in the region, but the river we're going to go and visit is the Banyas River. And the Banyas River is, oops, we missed the Banyas River, go back one step. I want to show me the Banyas River. Okay. We don't see the Banyas River. You know what a river looks like. It's a big flowing, lush river, and the highest waterfall in Israel is there. So it's a very important source of water for the Israelis. Today, they've managed to kind of get around the dependence on water in this area by desalinating seawater. But certainly as recently as 10 or 15 years ago, the vast majority of Israeli drinking water came from these springs and these streams being stored in the Sea of Galilee. Just above the hill from the Banyas, there is a beautiful big fortress, the Nimrod fortress in Hebrew. And there's some amazing footage which I can share with you here of the Nimrod fortress. So the Nimrod fortress is a bit of a silly name, really. It's named after this biblical hunter, Nimrod, who had absolutely nothing to do with the fortress whatsoever. It was actually built in the 1200s, built by the Muslims who were fighting against the Crusaders. Often it's called a Crusader castle, Nimrod's fortress. Well, actually, both of those things are not true. It was actually built by the Arabs, by the Muslims fighting against European Christians. You can see it dominates this very important hill. The main road to Damascus passes there. Below its ramparts, and then becomes a really important Mamluk castle just afterwards. So the famous Sultan Baybars conquers it, and he gives it to his second in command. It becomes his like personal castle. And believe it or not, this was actually used in a very important battle by the Mamluks against the Mongols. Yes, you heard me speaking correctly. The Mongols who came all the way from Mongolia through Central Asia, and they were defeated here. This is kind of the furthest sort of into the Middle East they got. They've got a couple of very important battles in and around this castle. This castle was also used in a very important Israeli movie. If anybody likes cinema, there's a film called Beaufort, which is all about Israeli troops invading Lebanon. And this fortress was used as the backdrop for this, because obviously, for obvious reasons, it's not possible for Israeli film crews to make movies in Lebanon. And I'll keep that fortress in mind because I want to talk more about Beaufort and Lebanon in just a moment. So we're going to leave Syria now and move to Lebanon. And from here, we're going to kind of move along the Lebanese border until we arrive at the coast, and we'll finish the tour there. The Lebanese border I've marked in blue because it's called the blue line. And there's one or two areas where the blue line is very heavily disputed. And one of them is just here in the hills to the north and west of that fortress, Nimrod Fortress. I should, by the way, give Nimrod's fortress its Arabic name because Nimrod is, like I said, nothing to do with the fortress. Kalat al-Subaida, which is the castle on the cliff. It's probably a more accurate name for Nimrod Fortress. But looking north from there, you see this piece of land which I've marked in yellow. This is what the Lebanese and Israelis both claim. It's known as the Sheba Farms. There's a Lebanese town just here to the north called Sheba. So this area is called the Sheba Farms. And it's an internationally disputed piece of territory. Of course, you might say, surely the whole Golan is disputed, and you'd be absolutely right. It's all considered internationally occupied territory. But the question is, really, is Israel occupying this from Lebanon or from Syria? The problem arises really in the French times, in the 1920s, when this all was French territory, and the border between French Lebanon and French Syria was pretty roughly mapped out. There were two different administrations, eventually became two independent countries, but the differences were pretty negligible. It didn't really matter where the specific border was. So all along this part of the border between where the Golan Heights begins and ends, there are these disputes. Lebanon absolutely says this was always part of French Lebanon. In fact, even the Syrians also agree. They say this is not Syrian territory that the Israelis are occupying, this is Lebanese territory. The international community is kind of divided on this, in fact. The UN does agree that Israel pulled out of occupied Lebanese territory. So they consider this to be Israeli occupied Syria, to make things more confusing. But this is a really hot spot for fighting between Israel and Hezbollah. Hezbollah are the terrorist organization in the south of Lebanon, and they absolutely claim this as their territory, and they fight very fiercely to win this territory back. And there have been several incidents. Every couple of years, there's something between Israel and Hezbollah in and around the Sheba Farms. Now, the other really interesting town, which is a similar situation, is the town of Raja, which is here slightly to the west of the Sheba Farms. And as you can see, the blue line cuts right through the middle of the village of Raja. A couple of very interesting things about Raja. First of all, it's an Alawite village. The Alawites are I guess it depends who you ask. Some would say a branch of Islam. Some Muslims consider the Alawites to be heretical, but they're Shia Muslims who follow a branch of 12 Islam, 12 Shia of Islam. Bashar al-Assad and the Assad family, they are all Alawite. So they're an ethnic minority in Syria who have ruled Syria for many decades now. And again, when this territory was either Syrian or Lebanese, and before that, French Lebanese and French Syrian, didn't really matter where the border was, and the border was not so important. The village grew and ended up being on both sides of this disputed line. And Israel ended up controlling both sides of the border starting in 1978. In 1978, Israel invaded Lebanon. And for most of the next 20 years, both sides of this village were under Israeli control. Of course, when Israel withdraws from Lebanon in the year 2000, there's a big debate about where to put this border. What I might do now is play a very short news clip so you can hear from some of the villagers themselves.
The village of Rajar perfectly captured the complexity of the Middle East. Within 1/2 century, it has been controlled by Lebanon, by Syria, and since the 1967 Six Days War, by Israel. Its inhabitants all have Israeli citizenship, but their heart belongs to Syria. They all Alawis, like President Bashar al-Assad. It is not easy for them. Jamil Wanous, the village carpenter, proved this. If he agrees to film, it is because we are alone in his workshop, and confidences are uttered between closed doors.
We are here, waiting for whoever who come. Going to Syria? I don't know. We are living in this village. But it's true that we feel Syrians. We are Alawites and we love Assad.
His son follows us to the north part of the village. Here where the border, the so-called blue line, runs, we have 1 foot in Lebanon. The UN peacekeepers are deployed a few meters away. They are the last obstacles before the intention manned by the anti-Israel, pro-Iran Hezbollah organization.
I would like to be on the Lebanese side. It's much better than here. I dream that there is no border.
Violent clashes between Syrian rebels and pro-Assad forces take place nearby. These Syrians all left someone on the other side of the border. Salman is an opponent to the regime. He never stops gathering testimonies.
Since the beginning of the revolution in Syria, the village is divided between pro and anti-Assad. This is not exactly 50-50, but it's a fact. There are those who think that Syrians deserve democracy and freedom, and those who think that Assad is the hero of the nation, that he must govern just because it's better like this.
These Syrians from the Golan know the future remains unclear. With or without Assad, they may have to choose a side once again, perhaps this time, even Israel.
So you can see just how complicated things are in Rajar. Today, just here, if you drive along this road from Israel, you enter the village through an Israeli military checkpoint. So only residents of Rajar are allowed to enter through here. You need a special military permission to get in. And you can, once you're in, enter all the way up to the edge of the fence, which runs along this ridge right here. So you can technically be in Lebanese controlled territory. This is one area where the UN say the Israelis have not withdrawn. The blue line runs right through the middle of the village, and this here is, according to the UN, part of Lebanon. It also means you end up with a crazy situation where some people living, especially in the north half of the village, are Lebanese citizens. Some of them are also Israeli citizens. So you have Lebanese citizens living here who are allowed to cross through the checkpoint and enter into Israel. Very, very unique situation. For many in the Israeli security, field, they consider this a very leaky border because there's they have no real control over what happens on the north side of the village, and how easy is it for people to enter from the north side of the village is up for debate. So there have been occasions when Hezbollah have entered Israel through Rajar. So for many, like I said, security-minded people, this is an absolute focus for them. And being Alawites means that they're a minority just about anywhere they go. Even if they were able to become Syrian somehow and the Golan Heights was to return, they would still be a minority in Lebanon, in Syria itself, which is just kind of adding to the fascinating, crazy situation. All right, so we don't have too much more time left. We're going to zoom along the Lebanese border now, stopping at a couple of interesting points before we make it to the Mediterranean. This is an Israeli kibbutz, which is built right on the Lebanese border. You can look behind us and see the Israeli kibbutz. Note this radio antenna, by the way. I'm going to refer to it in a second. You can see the snowy peaks where the ski field was earlier on. That's Mount Hermon. And all of this in front of us is Lebanon. Again, the border is really just down here at the bottom of the hill. So all of these towns are Lebanon. Lebanon today is obviously in a real crisis. Even for the last 10 or 15 years, the south of Lebanon has basically been under the control of Hezbollah. But the economic collapse of Lebanon has made this area very unstable and very tragic for the people who live there. But you can still see there's plenty of bigger houses and stuff in amongst all this. And off in the distance, you can see a couple of hills. And we're going to zoom over there now. Because on one of those hills, you will see Beaufort Castle. This is the Crusader-built castle, which is almost like a twin to the castle we saw on the Israeli side. You can see how it looks in all its glory here with the Lebanese flag flying on top of it. Incredible views across Lebanon. And as we look back to the south, you can see the Israeli kibbutz, Mizgavav, and there is, in a very, very faint distance, that radio antenna we could see earlier on. So I mentioned that Israel invaded Lebanon, first of all, in the 1970s. 1978, Israel invaded Lebanon. They said they were just going to go as far as the Litani River to stamp out terrorists who they said were attacking Israel from the north. In the end, they invaded with a full-scale force just a few years later, ended up occupying all of southern Lebanon, including this castle, including even the capital itself. They went all the way to Beirut. This castle was used as a castle, as a fortress, by Israeli soldiers all throughout that period, the late 80s and all of the 1990s. So it was still being used for its defensive purposes. And that movie, which I referenced, is all about these Israeli soldiers holed up here in Beaufort Castle. In 2000, Israel officially withdraws, only for them to re-invade Lebanon in 2006, fight another bloody war with Hezbollah. And since then, there's been fighting sporadically all the way across the border. There's still no official peace between Lebanon and Israel to this day. So just a bit further west, we're getting closer and closer to the Mediterranean. We come to a ruined synagogue. This is a synagogue from the 2nd century. You can see the Greek style columns here. And just in the other side of the door here are the ruins of a Maronite Christian village. So the Maronite Christians are mostly in Lebanon, but just like the Druze, have different population groups on different sides of the border. So there are also tens of thousands of Maronite Christians living on the Israeli side of the border, or at least let's say about 10,000. And one of their villages was here. This was the village of Bar'am. Now, Bar'am is really close to the Lebanese border. This is some of the homes. And in the 1948 war, the residents of Bar'am were told by the Israeli military they had to evacuate their homes because the war was being fought all around them, and crucially, they would be allowed to return. Now, most Palestinian villages in Israel proper, this was never given as a promise. No one ever told any Palestinians they would be able to return. Here, it's a subtle difference, but an important one, because there's official IDF documentation saying that the army said that these people could return. However, it may not surprise you to know that the army has never allowed these people to come back. They are mostly now living in a town just down the road. They're mostly now citizens of Israel. So they're able to visit this site as an Israeli national park. You must pay an entrance fee to visit the synagogue there, and then you can visit the ruins of the town. It's a crazy, crazy situation. If we go to the other side, go down. You can see the church of Beram. This is the Maronite church here. We're standing on the roof. There are very, very rare occasions when they're able to open the church and use it. So there have been weddings, ceremonies there. I'm actually lucky enough to have attended a service here, which was spoken in Aramaic, believe it or not, the language of Jesus at the time, with people from Baram, at least their descendants. It's now usually the third or even fourth generation. And you can see down here in the distance is that synagogue. It's just behind the trees. So this is all part of the national park where they mostly have to pay to enter. And this is actually, this and another village called Ikrit have been regularly dragged through the Israeli Supreme Court because of this promise to be allowed to return. So in many ways, it's the same story as the Nakba, where 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their village. But these two have a slightly different feature that they were told they should be allowed to return. But the result is the same either way. They never have been allowed to. Okay, we come to this point. This is another Israeli town where they've tried to kind of beautify the war. I always find this stuff very difficult to look at. I put all this graffiti on. The idea is that the wall is somehow less offensive. This is a famous Tel Avivi street artist, Damien Tab. There are also pictures like this, which show a Muslim woman and a Jewish man reaching out in peace. I would have thought that instead of painting on the wall, trying to tear the wall down and actually make peace would be a better solution, but that's not really likely to happen these days. There's a lot of kind of saber rattling. A lot of people in the Israeli military are talking very kind of seriously about the threat which Hezbollah pose. Hezbollah are getting a lot of weapons from Iran. So at the moment, this wall is being fortified more and more and more. And there's a lot of talk in the Israeli security establishment about the potential for another full-on war with Hezbollah. Of course, we hope for peace. But this wall is there between many many incidents today. Okay, so we're now at our final stop of the tour. We're right on the Mediterranean coast now. If you look to the left here, you can see the sea just beneath us, and we are right on the Israel-Lebanon border. This part of the border is not so controversial internationally because this is pretty much the border between British-controlled Mandatory Palestine and French-controlled Lebanon. That hasn't really changed so much. This is where the old railway line from Haifa to Beirut used to enter into a tunnel. You can see in the top there, SAEC 1942. It was built in the middle of World War II by the South African Engineer Corps, fighting alongside the rest of the British Empire. And they dug tunnels to connect the railway lines. It says no entry, closed military area, but we can actually enter inside the railway tunnel on today's tour. The tracks would have run along here and eventually come out the other side. And from there, it's only a short journey on till you reach, the rest of Lebanon, Beirut itself. Here's a couple of kind of before and after pictures. This shows the entrance to the tunnel today. And here you can see it as a railway tunnel. Now that tunnel was actually blown up in the middle of the 1948 war and has not been usable since. And it's one of my great dreams to one day take the train again from Haifa to Beirut. It's pretty hard to imagine it happening anytime soon, but we can dream. So let's just go to the top of that area. If we imagine that the tunnel there is just underneath us now, on the top of the hill, there is a border post. And just like the Israel-Syria border, the Lebanon-Israel border is closed. No tourists can cross there, but there have been occasions where people have crossed, special and rare occasions. For example, in the 2000s, when Israel pulls out of southern Lebanon, there were lots of Lebanese who had been fighting alongside the Israelis as allies. Mostly they were Christian, and they formed what's called the South Lebanon Army. And Israel did actually allow several hundred of these soldiers to come across the border, and they live today in Israel, which again is a crazy anomaly that Israel refuses to allow Palestinian refugees to return, and yet we have Lebanese people living in Israel today, usually called Sadalnikim by the Hebrew abbreviation, and many of them crossed through this border post. Here you can see the distances, just 120 kilometers up the road to Beirut, much closer to Beirut than you are, for example, to Jerusalem. And here is a military post. There's also a big UN base just on the other side of the border. We're going to end our tour today. This UN base. The UN patrols the Israel-Lebanon border and has done since Israel pulled out. Things have been a lot hotter on this border than they have on the Syrian border. There's many different nationalities who make up the force here called UNIFIL. This base here is manned by Indonesian soldiers, but there are also Finns and Fijians and Ghanaians who patrol along this border. Here are the UN cars and a couple of Indonesian soldiers who got cut off by the 360-degree camera. But the UN is still very, very much active in this area. And the final point I want to make is the UN have to be active here, because this is not an accepted and kind of internationally recognized border. It's pretty crazy to think, but Israel's northern borders are not yet set. They never have been. From the day that Ben Gurion declared Israeli independence back in May 1948, all the way up until today, these borders have always been disputed. Israel does not have peace deals with Israel or with Lebanon or Syria, and these borders today, both of them, still have UN forces trying to keep the peace and waiting for a final settlement. We hope, of course, that one day we can have a just solution to years of conflict, but for now, this is the situation as it stands. So my friends, that is where I'm going to stop talking for a moment. I really hope you've all enjoyed our whistle-stop tour of the northern borders of Israel. And we do still have plenty of time for questions and comments. So I'm going to go through the questions in the chat, but if anybody wants to raise hands or type things in the chat, I'll be very happy to try and get through as many questions as we possibly can. Ellen asks about the yellow line on the map. So it's true that I didn't talk about this at the time. This is the Litani River. So in 1978, when Israel first invaded, they said they would only go as far as the Litani River. This is the territory which they would control. But as I said, they ended up going much, much further, taking Sidon and even all the way up to Beirut. So they controlled a huge chunk, almost half of Lebanon, not just this little slither here in the south. Another interesting question in the chat: do the Druze in the Golan feel solidarity with Palestinians under Israeli occupation? Are there demonstrations to show sympathy with Palestinians in Gaza or in the West Bank? I think to an extent, yes, they do, right? They're both living under occupation by the same power. But I think that up here in the north, the Druze in places like Masjid al-Shams see much more, connection to the north, right? They really feel Syrian. To give you an idea of how close they are, here's Damascus. Damascus is less than an hour's drive from Masjid al-Shams if there wasn't a border in the way. So I think they feel much more, invested up here. Their family is here. It's not really very common for Druze to have family in the West Bank or in Gaza. It's kind of quite distinct in that sense. So yes, solidarity because they're both under occupation, but I think they realize kind of they're fighters in a different way maybe than the Palestinians. We can also do questions aloud, so if anybody wants to unmute themselves, that's also possible. A good question here from LW Lee. Are the in-person tours really open now for vaccinated tourists? And I definitely don't mind talking about how easy it is to visit Israel now. The answer is yes. Israel is now officially open and has been since early January. If you're recently vaccinated, you are able to enter. We are offering all of our tours, physical on-the-ground tours, just as we did in the good old days. So if anybody wants to come visit us, you are more than welcome to. We're offering all of our tours. The Golan Heights is somewhere that we can offer private tours to. Any of these sites, if you want to visit, they make a really cool kind of combination. You can even do an overnight trip up here. So if this has kind of piqued anybody's interest and you want to see more of the Golan Heights, the borders are now open and you can come and visit as long as you're vaccinated completely and the last dose was in the last 6 months. So hopefully that gives some people some inspiration.
Now, are we allowed to go to the Palestinian side?
West Bank.
To the West Bank?
Yeah, hi Farga, that's a great question. So first of all, to enter the West Bank, you have to go through Israeli checkpoints. So the Israeli rules, like to enter Israel, that kind of covers you for entering the West Bank. There were at some points in the pandemic, very early on, kind of different restrictions, and they try and kind of control people, but that hasn't happened for many, many months now, over a year. So the short answer is yes. Once you're in Israel as a tourist, you can visit Bethlehem, Ramallah, Hebron, Nablus, all the big Palestinian cities, just as you would have before the pandemic. So it's for a tourist, I should stress, for Palestinians, freedom of movement is much more complicated. But for tourists, if you come to visit, you can visit all these places pretty easily.
Yeah, oh, okay. Because we have been to Nablus a couple of times, but we asked whether we could go now under COVID. It's a bit difficult.
Yeah, it's not easy to travel under COVID. I'm not trying to kind of make any generalizations. It is complicated, but it is possible. And Nablus, like I'm sure you know, is a fabulous, fabulous city. So well worth a visit.
Thank you.
Thanks, Farka. Are there any other questions, folks?
Can I say something, Alex?
Please do, Olivia.
It's Olivia. Hello. Well, it was a fabulous tour. Fabulous. I enjoyed every second of it. And it's such a very complicated place. A film was released about Golan. Are you aware of that, Alex? About 10 days ago, made by an occupied Syrian Golan. I read a review of it in Haaretz. Feels like about 10 days ago. It sounded interesting. I think so. It's obviously been screened in Israel. I think it was called The Stranger. Am I correct?
Interesting.
Or have you heard about it?
No, it doesn't ring a bell to me, but that certainly doesn't mean...
Check it out, Alex. Check it out. I know the first scene, he spoke about the first scene. The first scene is of a very elderly man saying, all I want to do is go to Damascus. And I've been trying for the last 50 years. That's all. And then you can see the trailer, which I didn't see. But it did sound interesting. And that movie that you mentioned, The Syrian Bride, I thought it was beautiful. I mean, that's quite old, about perhaps 15 years ago. I thought that was lovely. Well, that's all. I have another little Druze episode in my life, but I'll tell you about it in a letter because I don't want to bore my fellow participants. So thank you, Alex. A fabulous tour. Thank you
very much. Always appreciate it.
Welcome. Check out the movie. Check out the movie, Alex.
The Stranger, you say, right?
I think it's called The Stranger, if I remember correctly. But the review was very recent. Or check it out in Haaretz. Article, just Google, whatever you wish.
Yeah. Cool.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the tip.
Thank you.
Excellent.
You're welcome.
It's also a good reminder for me to send you the link to The Syrian Bride if anybody wants to watch that other movie there, which we both mentioned. I'll paste this in the chat right now. There you go. So if anybody wants to see Syrian Bride, there's a few people asking about the Syrian Bride, giving good feedback. Another question is about the Allenby border, King Hussein border between the West Bank and Jordan. So that's complicated. It is open as far as I know, because things also change all the time, right? From one day to the next, both with the Israeli military making up new rules, but also COVID rules. So as far as I know, the border is open. So if anybody needs to get from the West Bank to Jordan, they can do. And it is not open to Israelis and internationals, foreign tourists need to apply for a visa for Jordan in advance. The latest information I have is they're not issuing Jordanian visas at the border, but if you have a visa in advance from an embassy, you can cross from that border and you can enter Israel from the Jordanian side.
We also did that, entering from the southern town Alat into Israel, Jordan, yeah, and back.
So that one is open. Yep, that's both those borders, both that border and the Jordan River, the Sheikh Hussein one near Beit Shan. Both those borders are open, and also the border between Eilat and Taba, the Egypt-Israel border. That's also open. So all those now are good to go, which is pretty exciting.
Into Israel and Egypt.
On our Green Olive tour several years ago, we went to visit a Druze village and had lunch with a Druze group of people. It was so interesting. I was wondering what the population of them is. Plus, because they can't intermarry outside the Druzeism, just curious. Also, are there any population of Druze in other countries, for example, the US?
Yeah, absolutely. So in Israel, like if you include Israel proper and the Israeli occupied Golan, there's like about 150,000 Druze. So it's it's a minority, but it's not like an at-risk minority. Some people maybe know the Samaritan group, which are down to a matter of hundreds of people. So they're not in the same risk as say the Samaritans are. The biggest population is in Syria, another large group in Lebanon. And yeah, there's diasporic Druze, certainly in the United States. I think there's about 50,000 Druze in the United States. So I think overall there's like maybe 2 million Druze, slight guess, kind of guesstimate, I guess, all around the world. And some I don't know if anyone knows Amal Clooney, the famous civil rights lawyer who married George Clooney. She's a Druze, and there are other influential Druze around the world. But yeah, certainly in the United States, you can find Druze communities, mostly Lebanese.
Well, if they marry outside the Druzeism, are there punishments or like written out of the book of Druze?
Yeah, so officially it never happens. You ask a Druze this and they said, oh, it doesn't happen. We only ever marry in our group. Actually, in the Syrian Bride in the film, there's a character, not wanting to spoil the plot, who does marry a Russian woman. And there's certainly a lot of tension between the family, not complete ostracization, but that's a big step, to marry outside the group is a big deal. But yeah, of course people do it. The facts of human nature are that it does happen. But yeah, it's still pretty rare, I think. Even today, most Druze do marry within Druze. But that's also true, by the way, in Israel for most Christians, most Jews, most Muslims. They, marrying within these groups is much more common than marrying from outside.
Mm-hmm.
Where did you go with Green Olive to meet Druze? Was that up near Haifa somewhere, or do you remember where you were?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Where were we? Well, we started out, of course, in Tel Aviv, and then we went all over. We went to along the Mediterranean to Caesarea, places like that. I was having a leg problem, so I'm not exactly. I stayed in the bus a lot, but it was fantastic going. Then when we went on the Green Olive tour, we actually stayed in Bethlehem at a Greek Orthodox family, with a Greek Orthodox family. So they had their own interesting story about when Israel came in. They said they took things and they had to start from scratch. How everybody has their own tale of woe.
Absolutely. No, I mean,
and we actually visited the Greek Orthodox church there, and It was very interesting. Fred, my husband, I don't know where he is, disappeared.
I'm here.
Oh, he's there. Tell them about that very interesting sort of clandestine meeting you went to.
Well, we started in East Jerusalem, and we went through the gate, and it was extraordinary. And we stayed for 5 nights with this Greek, it was either 3 or 5 nights with a Greek Orthodox family. And from their backyard, we looked over the fence to the Israeli settlement. And then if you looked to the left, you could see the Church of the Nativity, where Jesus was born, apparently.
Yeah. Bethlehem's a fabulous place, you know, tragically surrounded on 3 sides by Israeli settlements in the wall. But like you said, yeah, the Church of the Nativity and other places right in the center are great spots to visit. So I'm glad you were able to. I'm glad you're able.
And on Tuesday night, I think it was, we were supposed to go to a Palestinian resistance meeting.
Okay.
And someone was supposed to escort me from Green Olive, but they didn't show up, so I had to go on my own, which was really interesting. I had no problem finding the place, and there was a interesting group. I guess they were from Sweden.
Okay.
And they were part of the group that observes the border and what's going on in that area. And there was a Israeli giraffe resistor, a rapper, who gave an extraordinary talk about how he got arrested and multiple times for resisting the draft in Israel. But each time he was told that he should just agree to rejoin the army, and he refused, and finally they gave up and let him go.
You're all doing great publicity for what you can, the kind of people you can meet on a Green Olive tour. I really love it.
Yeah.
Thank you very much to all of you for your comments. I see it. Judith is waiting patiently with her hand up, so I have to stop you, Frederick, because we've not got so much time left. But Judith, do you want to have a question?
I have a question.
I just wanted to go to Judith first. Sorry, Ingrid, I'll come back to you in just a moment. Judith, are you there? Okay, Ingrid, go ahead if Judith isn't ready.
Yes, about the Golan Heights. I'm interested about the buffer zone between Golan Heights and Syria. Who can live there?
So this is all territory which was Syrian before. Maybe I'll share my screen again, just so everyone can see what we're talking about.
Yes, I didn't understand everything what you said because you spoke so very fast.
Right, sorry about that. So to clarify, the buffer zone is like a demilitarized zone. So yes, theoretically, there's no soldiers, army in there apart from the UN, but it is still territory which is controlled by Syria. So these towns, if we zoom in here, these towns are Syrian towns. And, you know, from Damascus, you drive right in here. The only place which is out of bounds, which you cannot access freely from the Syrian side, is Quneitra, the town that we saw in the video going through there. And there is a military checkpoint there, and you can only go in with a UN escort. But within the 2 purple lines, it is controlled by Syria, but the peace is kept by the UN.
Okay, then I understand. One more question. The travel document the man had, it was only in Hebrew.
Right, so the
not
one
in Arabic.
That actually wasn't a travel document. That was an internal ID. So that one was for use in Israel. That was for, you know,
okay.
But there would be a separate document, which would be like a more international looking passport-like thing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great, no problem. Thanks for your questions. Judith, are you there? Or Judith, sorry, are you there? Can you, Okay, I'll go to a question from the chat. Where was the question I wanted to ask? Maybe more comments, I guess. We had lots of people who've been on other Green Olive tours with us, which is great. People who've been to Hebron and Jenin, which is great. You can visit all of these places today. People are asking if it's possible to visit. Hebron is, as always, kind of a tragic kind of epicenter of the occupation. There's a lot of settler aggression going on in the hills south of Hebron, which is very, very sad, and we're monitoring very, very closely. But it is still open and visitable. So if you are able to come, it's great to show solidarity to some of these places and visit. So yes, all these places are free to enter. Excellent, my friends. Well, we're almost up to 8:30. So unless there are any pressing questions, we're going to have to soon say goodbye. I want to thank everybody once again so much for joining us. A few people have asked if this event was recorded and if it's going to be shared, and I'm happy to say yes to both. It's being recorded, and I'm going to post it onto our YouTube channel. So if you go to our YouTube channel, even now you can subscribe, and then as soon as the video is ready, you'll be able to watch it. You can share it with your friends. We'll also put it on the website as well, and you can see kind of the back catalogue of all the other events and online tours which we've done. Of course, if anybody wants to come visit us for real, we would love to welcome you again. So I will say this loud and clearly that the borders are now open, which is great. And of course, if you enjoyed today's tour and you'd like to leave.
Good morning, Dan.
You can leave a question here at this link.
Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah.
Someone's got the microphone unmuted. But it's almost the end of the tour, so I'll let him off the hook. So yes, the link there is in the chat. If you need to type it, contribute.greenolivetours.com. It's really massively appreciated. It supports our work so much. And of course, like I said, we're donating 10% of it to this very worthy charity, the PCRF. So we thank you for whatever you want to leave, and whatever you felt today's tour was worth. So my friends, I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you all so much for joining once again. Hope you have a great day wherever in the world you are, and we hope to see you again very soon.
Thank you, Alex. Take care and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you put the link to the film, please?
Yes, I'd be happy to. I'll do that now.
Thank you, Alex.